Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, December the 25th, 2024. Happy Christmas! And this Christmas Day, the moon is moving through Scorpio, and that's going to be my theme. I'm going to look at what it means for the moon to be in Scorpio. And I'm also going to consider some famous and some infamous people who do have this sign placement. And, it's an interesting group of people, very much the good, the bad and the ugly, but I hope you find it interesting. Anyway, before I look at the moon in Scorpio, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Christmas Day 2024. So here is the chart for today, noon, set for New York, and you can see that noon, New York time, the moon is in Scorpio. It's at 4 degrees 24 of the sign. In fact, the moon moves into Scorpio at 9:06 a.m. London time. So if you're in the Americas, then the moon moved into Scorpio very, very early in the morning, Christmas morning. Now, if you're in Europe, so kind of late morning, mid-morning, moon moves into Scorpio. Now, if you're in Australia and New Zealand, then the moon won't move into Scorpio until this evening. So that's the main thing going on. I would have said moon moving into Scorpio. And the moon, having moved into Scorpio, will make a square aspect to Pluto and a square aspect to Mars. So there's Mars, there's Pluto. So in fact, we have a T-square today. So you've got moon in Scorpio, square Mars, square Pluto. Moon is on the T. And so that could indicate Mars, Pluto in fixed signs, Mars, Leo, Aquarius, Scorpio. This could indicate that, Mars, Pluto represents power and how we want to express our power. And, I know it's supposed to be Christmas Day and everyone is supposed to be happy, but, Christmas Day can be difficult. Don't they always say that over Christmas, this is when arguments come to the surface? From a domestic perspective, it's often not the most harmonious day of the year. And maybe this is indicated by Mars opposition Pluto with Moon in Scorpio on the T. Once people start arguing with each other, if they start arguing with each other, then there may be no end of it. So if I had any advice for this Christmas, well, try to be uncontroversial. And if there is any arguing or people disagree with each other, it shouldn't be a matter of principle. Maybe someone has got to compromise. Someone has got to sort of back down. So that is potentially a bit of a problem. And the moon is in early Scorpio. And early Scorpio is arguably the worst part of the sign. So for example, noon, New York, moon early Scorpio, the moon is pretty close to its degree of maximum fall. So you could say, well, the moon is exalted at 3 degrees Taurus, so therefore at 3 degrees Scorpio, you could say is the worst place for the moon to be. So I think that requires a lot of care. And of course, early Scorpio moon represents the Via Combusta. The Via Combusta is that part of the sky where things can go wrong. And Via Combusta stretches from 15 Libra to 15 Scorpio. And I would have said the Scorpio half of the Via Combusta is more difficult than the Libra half. So, this is why I'm emphasizing the moon in Scorpio, why I've got a scorpion on the thumbnail of this video. I think that, this matters, and we just don't want to get our emotions sort of in a tangle, getting emotions out of control. So that is a problem. But it needn't be such a problem, because the moon, having made the square to Mars, square to Pluto, it does make a sextile to the sun. So moon 4 degrees Scorpio, making a sextile to the sun at 4 degrees Capricorn. So that represents something of a relief. Maybe one might have arguments, one might have disagreements, but then at some stage that moon sextile sun cuts in, and sun in Capricorn can be quite serious, can be quite disciplined, can be quite organized. Moon sextile sun, perhaps the general sense of harmony can be rediscovered. And talking about the sun, we also have a quincunx aspect between the sun and Mars. So quincunx between sun and Mars, I mean, that can be a difficult aspect. You've got these two planets, both very positive, fiery planets, in quincunx with each other. It's like people are competing with each other. People are trying to be in control, and things could get out of hand quite quickly. So, I'm not saying it's going to be a bad Christmas. I'm just saying it's a Christmas where we have to take it slowly, and we mustn't jump to conclusions, and we shouldn't be too obsessed about being right or feeling that we have to get our way regardless. There is a time for compromise, and perhaps even for letting another person win. Perhaps it's some petty matter you're arguing about that doesn't really matter, and if you just say, you just take the view, well, you don't care. If someone wants to feel good, if someone wants to feel right, then fair enough. Let them get on with it. So that's the main thing going on. Things going on astrologically, and what you have here is a chart for New York. So let's just look at the picture for Sydney, Australia. So Sydney, Australia at noon. The moon is definitely not in Scorpio. It's 26 Libra. And so if you're in Australia and New Zealand, I would have said, all things being equal, you're going to have a better Christmas than if you're in the Americas or in Europe. It's a moon in Libra Christmas. And so it might not be so exciting, but I don't think there'll be so much drama, and I think it's going to be easier for people to get on with each other. Now, turning to the heliocentric picture, I mean, maybe Christmas Day, but the planets, they keep moving. We shouldn't forget about them. We shouldn't think that they're no longer having an influence on our lives, that they're somehow on holiday. They're not on holiday at all. So turning to the heliocentric picture, here we have it. So from a heliocentric perspective, Christmas Day, Mercury at 29 Virgo, Neptune 29 Pisces. So we have a Mercury-Neptune square. And so Mercury-Neptune square is about perhaps people getting confused mentally, getting the wrong idea about things. And so, we shouldn't necessarily believe what other people say, but maybe it's Christmas Day, it doesn't matter. We can let people say what they like and not feel that it's so important that everyone gets their facts straight. But don't jump to conclusions this Christmas. Though on the plus side, you could say that Mercury opposition Neptune is, or can be, a fairly spiritual influence. Some of us may be able to pick up sort of high-level communications. Maybe the universe is trying to tell us something, and it could be important. But if we get messages from the universe, we shouldn't just take them at face value. Perhaps we need to sit on them, try to work out what the universe is trying to tell us. And really, that's about it as far as the heliocentric picture is concerned. And now I want to switch to the 12 signs. And as it's Christmas Day, I will try to keep my forecasts of the 12 signs as brief as possible. Usually I try to stick to sort of 5 minutes at least per sign. But maybe if I can stick it, maybe only 3 minutes per sign. Is that okay? I mean, I don't know. I'll see how it goes. Anyway, these are my forecasts for today, which is Wednesday, December 25th, 2024, for the 12 signs. Aries. So Aries, the moon is moving into Scorpio. And with the moon in Scorpio, you might be starting to look at things in a rather different way. And so, we've just had the moon in Libra. And so with the moon in Libra, I think that ideally you were trying your hardest to look at things from other people's point of view. And I think to some extent you were being successful. But with the moon in Scorpio, you're starting to think about yourself and your own needs a little bit more. And I think that your emotions are powerful. Don't underestimate your emotions at this time. And there are things that could get you annoyed. After all, the moon in early Scorpio is making a square to Mars and a square to Pluto. And Aries, if something does get you annoyed, you may not be able to help yourself. You may just feel that you have to make your views clear. Either that, or you might just want to disengage. So I think, Aries, you have to be very aware of the pressures of the times in which you are living. In particular, the day in which you're living, Christmas Day. I suppose you don't want to be the one to spoil things, and it could just so easily be. It could be really easy for you to get annoyed today, to be honest. Not such a problem if you're in Australia or New Zealand. I think if you're in Australia or New Zealand, I don't really think it's such a problem. But in the Americas and Europe, I think you really do have to be careful about the kind of impression you're giving. And also, the Sun is making a quincunx to Mars. So with the Sun quincunx Mars, there's an added factor that makes you a little bit tense. And I think that factor, Aries, might be that you're concerned that maybe you should be doing something else. So, you've got Mars is in Leo. And so Mars is your ruler, it's in Leo. It's going retrograde, but in Leo, it's in some respects, it's a great place for Mars to be, Leo. It's about you, and you kind of want to get in the spirit of the day. I mean, into the spirit of Christmas, relaxing, enjoying yourself, wearing the party hat, or all that kind of thing. I mean, you're fine with that in some respects, if it wasn't for the fact that the environment may not be perfect. But even if the environment were to be perfect, you may just be distracted by feeling that somehow you're wasting your time, that it would be better if you were doing something useful. And in that sense, with this Sun quincunx Mars, you may almost resent the fact that it's Christmas Day, perhaps. I mean, I'm not saying every Aries is going to feel like that, but I do think that is certainly a possibility. So maybe you can kind of get the best of both worlds. I think ideally you won't allow your day to get too intense. You won't allow any single person or any single group of people to dominate the proceedings. You can take the view, okay, you're going to give people some of your time, maybe even quite a lot of your time, but it just does seem that there are other things you want to focus on. And if you are focusing on something else, something that is important to you, and I mean, it may be to do with work, for example, or your plans for the future, that will be kind of giving you a bit of a release. It will be sort of letting off pressure. So I think that your main job is to make sure that you don't get too annoyed, that you don't express your annoyance, and that somehow, I think you can do it, but perhaps you just need to give yourself a certain amount of flexibility and give yourself a space to do what you regard as being important, and then I think you should be able to navigate the day without too many problems. Taurus, moon moving into Scorpio, and the moon is in your opposite sign, obviously. Scorpio is the opposite sign to Taurus, and so when the moon moves into Scorpio, it makes a square to Pluto and it makes a square to Mars. And so that means that there may be a certain amount of pressure. I mean, you certainly understand that other people have their demands, and to an extent you have to fit in, and you have to, understand, what other people are thinking, what other people are expecting. But at the same time, you've got other priorities. It might feel that you have other priorities, and it's perhaps connected with the fact that there is a Mars-Pluto opposition forming. So we had this Mars-Pluto opposition actually quite a long time ago. We had this Mars-Pluto opposition around the time of the election, just around the time that Trump got re-elected. And so this Mars-Pluto opposition is back, and it's hitting an important axis of your chart, a chart that's often connected with home, family, work, perhaps the home family, the work family balance and getting that right. And so you're feeling this Mars-Pluto opposition, and then the moon is coming along and you're really starting to feel it. And Taurus can be a stubborn, inflexible sign, and so with this T-square involving Mars, Pluto and the moon, I don't think you're going to be particularly flexible. And I suppose in an extreme situation you could sort of walk off in a huff, because it's not where you want it to be. I don't think the way Christmas is arranged, I mean, this is especially the case, of course, if other people are arranging Christmas, and the way things are unfolding, if it doesn't work out exactly how you want it, you might get a bit upset, and you could spoil things just by saying the wrong thing, or just by telling people how you feel. It might seem the right thing to do, but a word out of place, an action, a gesture out of place, it could spoil the day. On the plus side, the moon, having made that square to Mars and Pluto, it does make a sextile to the sun. And what I'm hoping is that moon sextile sun starts to make itself felt as early as possible. And moon sextile sun is a very nice, harmonious aspect. And I think what that moon sextile the sun is really about, in this case, is about getting a sense of perspective. Perhaps not treating everything as being a matter of life and death. Not allowing yourself to get upset. taking the view that nothing is particularly significant, that you've got to take a broader view. And if you can just do that, if you can just get through to that moon sextile the sun, somehow try to see the bigger picture, then I think that in the end things should be okay. Gemini, to an extent, it depends where you are. I think that if you're in Australia and New Zealand, then I think that Christmas Day should be fine. I mean, the moon will be moving through late Libra, and there may not be a huge amount going on, but I don't think there's going to be any major disagreements. I think that you'll get through the day fine. Okay, by the evening there may be some complications, but perhaps by this evening, the main action will be over. Yet, if you are in Europe or the Americas, it may be a different picture. And part of the problem is the moon is going to be in Scorpio. And Scorpio, from a Gemini perspective, is just a difficult energy. And as far as you're concerned, Gemini, you may regard everything as just being just too much like hard work, and you won't easily get into the spirit of the day. And at the same time, if you are being pressured to do things, you might not take kindly to it, and there could be actually an uncharacteristic display of stubbornness on your part. And, the moon is making a square to Mars, it's making a square to Pluto. And, that Mars square Pluto opposition, you certainly seem to have ideas. And if you're open about your ideas and you tell people what you really think, I mean, part of you kind of wants to tell people what you think, but if you are too open, then there could be problems, and you might almost at an unconscious level be trying to engineer some kind of disagreement in that Gemini kind of way. Gemini are very good at doing that. They can say the last thing anyone wants to hear, and that can be a real problem. Now, on a more serious note, Moon in Scorpio is quite health orientated. It's in a sector of your chart connected with health and well-being, and I suppose you could say, well, it's Christmas, and Christmas can sometimes be a time of overindulgence, eating, drinking, and so forth, and so Moon in Scorpio might encourage you to sort of overdo it. And I suppose if one's trying to be sort of physical about it, Moon in Scorpio represents things that are quite slow. Things don't move. I mean, you can kind of get the sensation with Moon in Scorpio of just perhaps eating something and it just sits there and you just feel bloated and it just doesn't feel good, Moon in Scorpio, and it sort of makes you a little bit annoyed, and it's quite possible that the way you feel physically may interact with your mood and what you say, and if you're not feeling good, you might want to tell other people you don't feel good, and that just might make you just feel annoyed. I think the sort of a medieval Shakespearean way of looking at it would be to say that you might be a little bit choleric. Choleric, I think, it's an old word. I suppose cholera comes from a word, doesn't it? It sort of means yellow, and I suppose in Shakespeare's time, people talked about sort of yellow bile, cholera, because of that link with yellow. But it's sort of linked with just feeling annoyed, and your annoyance being linked with the way you feel. And so, perhaps in order to protect yourself from this annoyance, it may just be a good idea to be moderate in everything you do, and in particular, don't eat too much, don't drink too much. I mean, I know that might sound a truism because it's Christmas Day, but I think there are astrological grounds for thinking that that might actually be the case. So Gemini, that's something to look out for. I think perhaps if you try to avoid temptation and you don't overdo it, I mean, I think it can be better. I think you're quite capable of presenting yourself today in a way that is favourable. You can get people to like you. It is possible, and so perhaps if you can be moderate, and if you can just tell people how you see things, what you want as well, but you can just be reasonable about it, I think people will listen. And just a reminder that Mercury is in Sagittarius, and Mercury in Sagittarius is your opposite sign. So Gemini is obviously, Mercury rules Gemini. So when Mercury is in Sagittarius, it is a time when you should just be making some effort to relate to other people and try to see things from their perspective. And there's no need to get annoyed, and just try to work out in general, Gemini, what things in the past have got you annoyed, and then perhaps today you can try to avoid them. Cancer, the moon is moving through Scorpio. It's moving into Scorpio. So if you're in Australia and New Zealand, then the moon won't move into Scorpio until late in the day. But it does get there in the end. Anyway, moon in Scorpio, for many people, can be a problem because the moon often doesn't work particularly well in Scorpio. But Cancer, I think for you it's actually okay. I don't think you mind the moon being in Scorpio. It's a time when you can be yourself, and you're just familiar with what is going on. And I think that that's perhaps part of a problem for many people. It is Christmas Day, and I mean, okay, it's fine if you're alone or if people are alone, but Christmas Day, people come together, family members can come together, and there can be a high level of intensity, which some people are just not used to, particularly emotional intensity. Now, you as a Cancerian are familiar with this. I don't think you're fazed by it. And, you can understand what's happened emotionally. And so perhaps this is something you can use. And perhaps you can use your understanding of the emotional environment to engineer it in such a way that bad things don't happen. And I think, Cancer, if you can be aware, and if you can turn on your emotional scanners, you'll start to see how things are unfolding, and then perhaps you have an opportunity to take evasive action. Remember, moon making square to Mars, square to Pluto. You can feel that tension rising over the course of the day, but then the moon, having made that square to Mars, it makes a sextile to the sun. And so moon sextile sun is a really nice aspect, Cancer. And I think that is something that you can really take advantage of. And it might be about how you relate to people. And perhaps in the end, you can relate very well. And I think you can relate in a very sort of grounded but emotionally aware way. And I think that people will appreciate your company. And, I know I've kind of suggested when I've looked at others, when I'm looking at other signs, that it might be a difficult Christmas Day. But I think wherever you are, you perhaps have the capacity to create a certain amount of healing. And I'm not saying that because of Chiron. It's not about Chiron. It's just about the fact that the moon is sextile the sun. You're very aware of what's happening. You can anticipate what's happening. And you also realize that if people are getting annoyed for whatever reason, that it's something quite temporary, and perhaps you can just help move people along. And hopefully you can start to take advantage of that moon sextile sun, and perhaps other people can take advantage of it, because when the moon is sextile the sun, we do have a sense of harmony. So perhaps Cancer, that's in the end something that you can create. So overall, Cancer, I think you're a force for good today, and I think you are a good person to have around. Leo, today there is a quincunx aspect between the Sun and Mars. So Sun, of course, is your ruler, and then Sun is quincunx Mars. So those two planets, Sun and Mars, they can be somewhat willful. They want things done their way. They are fiery, masculine planets, and when they're quincunx, you get the perhaps principle of two strong forces which aren't clicking together and are perhaps at odds with one another. And so Sun quincunx Mars could represent a personality clash somewhere along the line. You and someone else simply may not get on, or you just may feel that something has to be done. You want action and you're not quite sure how to do it. Or it could also be that you had an idea about how you wanted the day to unfold, and something or someone comes along and threatens everything. But it's a quincunx, and with a Sun quincunx Mars, there does seem to be a way to deal with this energy, because just because two people or two energies clash with one another doesn't mean it's a problem. Maybe it's something that can be used perhaps to make the day more constructive and more exciting. And it is going to be difficult to make sense of it all, to bring the Sun and Mars together, but I think that it might be possible. And this raises the question of, what kind of day would you like to have? Well, the moon is moving into Scorpio, and with a moon moving into Scorpio, Scorpio is at the bottom of your chart. It's a very personal area of your chart, and to be honest, I think you want a Christmas where you are in control, and you don't want to have strangers around. You don't want other people setting the agenda for you. You want to be safe and secure and at home, and you probably have an idea about the way Christmas should be, and if other people have different ideas, you might not take kindly to it. And we shouldn't forget that the moon is making a square to Mars, and it's making a square to Pluto. So with moon square Mars, you could get annoyed. There are things that could annoy you, and we throw Pluto in, and we even more so. Fortunately, the moon, having made that sextile to Mars, makes a sextile to the Sun. So over the course of a day, if you do find yourself getting irritated, I would suggest that you don't necessarily show your irritation, you sit it out. I don't think you're going to have to sit it out very long. Eventually the moon will make a sextile to the Sun, and moon sextile Sun is about harmony, it's about stability, it's about feeling secure, and I think security is very important to you, and feeling that you are back in control. And so if there are moments over the course of the day when you feel that you're not in control, I would have said don't panic, because I think that you will have a chance to restore control without having to make a scene. Virgo, moon moving into Scorpio, and so with the moon moving into Scorpio, you do have things you would perhaps like to say, and I think that you're going to be quite good at expressing yourself, and I think in most cases people will understand what you're talking about. And so Virgo, over the day you can relate to people. I think actually relate to people extremely well, provided you don't get sidetracked. I suppose, the moon moving in through Scorpio, it does make a square to Mars, so perhaps moon square Mars could be something that bothers you, or you might want to point something out, or you just might say something that you didn't really mean. But pointing things out may not be a good idea, and some things are perhaps best left unsaid. So that might be a theme there. And so just because you feel something, and just because you feel something really strongly, it doesn't mean you have to talk about it. And the moon eventually does make a sextile to the sun, and I think you really need to focus on that moon sextile sun. And moon sextile sun is about you being able to not just be yourself, but also to enjoy yourself and to be able to relax. So relaxation today is not going to be immediate. You have to get used to the situation, and this is especially the case if you're in sort of Europe, America. In Australasia, it's a little bit different. In Australasia, your Christmas is possibly going to be somewhat non-committal. I don't think there's going to be a great deal happening over Christmas, and that's probably a good thing. And you'll perhaps be quite relieved. Things just don't seem to be going anywhere, and because the moon is moon is in late Libra, it's not really making any aspects in late Libra. There might be some lingering concerns about money in Australia and New Zealand, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. But if you're not in Australia or New Zealand, if you are in Europe and America, then it just takes some time to get used to things, and you perhaps have to see through any sense of irritation or annoyance and find that moon sextile sun. And when you get into that moon sextile sun, I think you'll know it, because you will suddenly find that you're able to relax, that you're able to enjoy yourself, you're able to enjoy people's company, and don't feel that you're restricted to any one place. Moon in Scorpio is a fixed sign, and you might feel you want to spend all of Christmas in one place, but you don't have to spend it in one place. Perhaps it might be a good idea to give yourself a little bit of variety. Maybe spend Christmas in 2 or even 3 places. Might not be such a bad idea. Libra, this Christmas may to an extent depend on where you are. Now, if you are in Australia and New Zealand for most of Christmas, the moon will be in late Libra. It will be void, of course, in the sense that the moon will have made its last major aspect to an undiscovered, its last major aspect to a traditional planet. So the moon will have made that aspect, and the moon will kind of be going nowhere, at least until this evening. So assuming that the main action takes place this Christmas sort of around sort of lunchtime, the afternoon maybe, I think that you'll just be able to enjoy the moon moon moving into Libra. Nothing much will be going on, and you can just have a relatively quiet day. Now, if you are in other parts of the world, then it may be different. The moon is leaving Libra. Moon's in Scorpio. So with the moon in Scorpio Libra, it may be difficult to entirely relax, because there may be other things bothering you. For example, I don't know, money, for example. Money, yes. Moon in Scorpio can be concerned about things, the value of things, and the moon is making a square to Mars. So moon square Mars could be an argument about money or possessions or who owes what. I mean, I know it's supposed to be Christmas. You're not supposed to be having these concerns, but you might be having these concerns. And the moon is also square Pluto. So there may be a sense that people are holding on to something very tightly, and they do find it somewhat difficult to let go. And you should perhaps see this as like a sort of a passing storm, passing turbulence. And, when you get through that storm, the moon in Scorpio does make a sextile to the sun in Capricorn. And I think that moon sextile, the sun in moon in Scorpio sextile, the sun in Capricorn, can allow you to start to stabilize things. And you shouldn't underestimate your ability to have an influence today. And maybe that's what you need to realize. You might feel that it's all out of your control. There's nothing you can do. But that's not true. If you tell people what's on your mind and you do it in quite a persuasive way, you maybe actually can persuade people to change their approach, or you may be able to convince people of things. And it might just be important that you're able to do that. And I think that will also maybe help you to, take control of things. So don't regard yourself, Libra, as being in a weak position. And Librans can be manipulative. And I think today this is something you can do. So if you want things to happen in a particular way today, then I think that you can engineer it so eventually you get what you want. Scorpio, moon is moving into your sign, and I know that moon in Scorpio can be a problem because the moon in Scorpio is in it's fallen in Scorpio, but for you I think it's different. I think that with the moon moving into Scorpio, you feel a sense of familiarity, a feeling that you actually understand what's happening around you. Not everyone understands it, but I think you get it, and I think you have a good understanding of other people's psychology. And particularly, it's Christmas, you may be dealing with people. I suppose you're going to be dealing with people in general who you know quite well, particularly if they're members of your family or close friends. You understand their psychology and you understand their likes and dislikes, and that I think can help you sort of navigate the day. But I'm not saying that it's going to be entirely smooth, because the moon in Scorpio does make a square to Pluto and a square to Mars. Now everyone has this because today, Mars is opposition Pluto, moon is square Mars, moon is square Pluto. So it got this T-square, and it's in fixed signs. You're a fixed sign. So I think it's very likely that you're going to be impacted by it. And so with moon square Mars, you are Scorpio, you're going to want to get your way. I think you really are. And there are things I think that you're really going to want to do. And you're not really going to be in the mood for doing things other people's way. So Scorpio, if it is something you want to do today, which may have absolutely nothing to do with Christmas, it might just be something you need to do. It's very much about you and your priorities. If it's something you want to do, make sure you do it. And don't go in for half measures, because if you have half measures, you're not going to be satisfied. And so perhaps you should put yourself and your needs first, and put family, other people, their needs second. So to start with, if possible, do what you have to do, get it out of the way, and then perhaps you can focus more on other people. And that's how the sequence runs, because if you look at the way it runs, the moon moves into Scorpio, it makes a square to Pluto, it makes a square to Mars, then it makes a sextile to the Sun. So that suggests to me, get everything out of the way, get your own priorities out of the way. Then moon sextile Sun, I think, is an aspect that strikes me as being pretty pleasant, and it allows you to be a nice person and a sensible person and a reasonable person. So all of that is possible. And in a way, the more selfish you are, the nicer you are. Because if you are selfish, it means that you are prioritizing yourself. There's no sense of resentment about it because you're doing whatever you want to do. But no resentment there. And yeah, once you've got it out of the way, you can be a nice person. I mean, you're always a nice person, but you can be an extra nice person once you have done whatever you feel you need to do. Sagittarius. Sagittarius moon is starting to move through into Scorpio, and I suppose that means, from a Sagittarian perspective, that this Christmas Day, you're not really feeling in a typically Sagittarian mood. You know, I suppose people think about Christmas as being a time for being maybe, the life and soul of the party, someone who's really trying to make things happen, trying to create excitement, all of that kind of standard textbook Sagittarius stuff. But today, I don't think so. I think that you will appreciate your own company, very much so. And I don't think that is a problem, although you understand that other people can't be ignored. So you might be slightly torn. You will appreciate your own company, that's true. You also understand that other people have their needs. And so to an extent, I think it's going to be a balancing act. And this isn't just because the moon is in Scorpio, it's also perhaps because Jupiter is still square Saturn. I mean, Jupiter was exactly square Saturn yesterday, but it's still square Saturn. And I think that with that Jupiter square Saturn, you just may not be entirely comfortable when you're with people, having to do things that other people want. You just be happier, in your own space. That's the way you would like it. And so I suppose, Sagittarius, you may have to ask yourself, what can you get away with? Can you get away with just retreating into your own private world, which you may well be able to? I mean, sometimes people have Christmases where they're completely alone. And, I've discussed this before, sometimes a Christmas alone can be absolutely great. You get into that wonderful silence you have on days like Christmas Day. Sometimes you get it on New Year's Day. There is that amazing silence. It's so brief, but it can be quite incredible. Certainly, my memories of the UK, because the UK completely shuts down December the 25th, December the 26th, and so if you're alone over Christmas, that can actually feel quite special. But you have to ask yourself what you can get away with, and it's not just what you can get away with in terms of what other people can stand. Can they stand you completely withdrawing? But it's also about your own capacity for being alone. How alone do you want to be? I mean, you don't have to be totally alone. There just may be certain things you want to keep to yourself. And if you're keeping things to yourself and people aren't asking questions, then at least in terms of surface appearances, you can go through the motions of being very sociable. But I don't think your heart is quite there. Capricorn. Capricorn, you perhaps have a certain reputation for being a little bit distant, and serious. You don't completely want to get into the spirit of things, perhaps, because you know there are more important things to consider. Yet, with the moon moving into Scorpio, the moon making a sextile to the sun, we've got the moon in Scorpio, sextile the sun in Capricorn. Actually, Capricorn, that can make you pretty sociable. And, this Christmas Day, I know I'm perhaps being a little bit of a Scrooge when I analyse this Christmas Day. I probably shouldn't have put out a video today as well. I shouldn't have put out a video today, because you could argue, well, I had nothing positive to say about today, or very little that was positive today, so I should have just shut up. But with the moon sextile the sun today, I think actually you can get into the spirit of things. Moon in Scorpio for Capricorns can be very sociable, especially when the moon is sextile the sun in Capricorn. So I think it can be a day when you can behave properly. I think that you'll know how to socialize, you'll know how to make people happy, and I think that actually you're going to be quite considerate and understanding. I think you'll understand what people want, what people need. I think you'll be quite able to provide it, and there will at the same time be an underlying sense of seriousness about you. Not the kind of seriousness that shuts everything down, but a seriousness that allows things to proceed. I suppose in many cases there is a certain ritual connected with Christmas. It depends on your Christmas. It depends on your culture. It may be if you're on continental Europe, Christmas Eve is not Christmas Eve as a big event. It's not Christmas Day. But, whatever's planned for Christmas Day, I think you can make it happen in its own way. And at the same time, we did have yesterday Jupiter square Saturn, and we still have this square between Jupiter and Saturn. And if you remember when I was talking about yesterday, when I was looking at your chart, I pointed out that Saturn was on the Sun-Uranus midpoint. You can see this here. There's Sun, there's Uranus, and Saturn's in the middle, and it's still there. And with that Saturn on the Sun-Uranus midpoint, there is something about you that actually can be quite exciting. You have an idea about what could happen, what is perhaps possible, and you may be able to spring a surprise. And that surprise could work both ways. Okay, it could be a surprise that people don't appreciate, but it could be a surprise that really makes the day happen. So if you feel that things are a bit slow, and perhaps you also feel that other people think things are a bit slow, you might almost feel other people's dissatisfaction and maybe a little bit of boredom. You can feel it, and then you can be the person to turn things round. Just make a suggestion. What would you like to suggest? And you make this suggestion, and it can change everything. So if there is a time today when things just don't seem to be moving, I think you can actually make things moving, and it just may be all about showing everyone who you are and how you have a unique and very exciting perspective. Aquarius, the moon is moving into Scorpio, and I think the moon moving into Scorpio may actually work quite well for you, provided you handle it in the right way. So with the moon moving into Scorpio, Aquarius, you may be starting to think about what you'd like to do and the kind of impression you want to make. And it may actually be a time, Aquarius, where you are becoming rather ambitious. You're thinking about things you'd like to do, and that might not sound entirely in keeping with today. I mean, it's supposed to be a holiday. I suppose it depends where you are culturally, but it's usually a holiday, isn't it? Christmas Day. And so you may feel that it's not a day where, at least on the surface, where you can actually do what you want to do, because there are other things to worry about. But I do think with that moon in Scorpio, you don't need to be distracted by the fact that it's a holiday. I think that there are things you want to get together, and your ambition could actually be quite intense, because the moon in Scorpio makes a square to Pluto. And remember, Pluto just gone into your sign in November. Pluto moved into Aquarius. Then Pluto the moon moves towards a square of Mars. So kind of got a T-square. And that T-square is in fixed signs. You're an Aquarius, you're a fixed sign. So that T-square today is quite motivating, and you may feel that, okay, something is preventing you doing what you want to do, and it may be other people. And so I suppose it's possible that Moon in Scorpio encourages you to make a fuss, or to get frustrated, or to vent your anger. I suppose that's possible. But I think that Moon in Scorpio means that you've got to just give yourself some time today to just concentrate on what matters to you and what your ambitions are for the future. And it shouldn't matter too much that it's Christmas Day. And in fact, it's just possible that some of the people around you actually could be helpful. I mean, it's easy to think that there is a conflict going on. There's a conflict between what you want to do and the demands of other people. And you'd prefer to be selfish, but then you've got to be reasonable. It's Christmas Day. But maybe that conflict doesn't actually exist. Maybe it doesn't need to exist. Perhaps you should tell people what you want. Tell people what you're planning on doing. Tell people about your ambitions. And you might be surprised by the response. And the moon, having made a square to Mars, it makes a sextile to the sun. And that moon sextile sun kind of emphasizes the point even more. Moon sextile sun could, in certain situations, be some kind of partnership. So even though it's Christmas Day, it may be that you find a connection with another person which could be very useful and could be very beneficial. And in general, that moon sextile sun is quite harmonious. I think it's that moon sextile sun that kind of saves the day. I'm not just talking about Aquarians. I think that for everyone, moon sextile sun creates that harmony. And I use this word harmony again and again. When a moon is sextile the sun, it sort of supports the life principle. It allows people to be themselves. It's life-giving, it's life-affirming. And so we got that over Christmas. And I think you can really tune into that sextile of the sun. And that affirmation of life is, it's not just coming from you, it's coming from other people. And I think that if you make the effort and you give people an opportunity to show their worth, I do think in the end you could be pleasantly surprised. Pisces, the moon is in Scorpio, and I said yesterday, I think when I talked about Tuesday's picture. I sort of mentioned to you, I think, that the moon would go into Pisces, and that would the moon would go into Scorpio, and that would create a change. And I think in many respects that moon in Scorpio is a change for the better, because Scorpio and Pisces have a sort of a natural connection with one another. And so while for some people it might be quite problematic, the moon moving into Scorpio, I think for you it just may feel that things are moving again. And moon in Scorpio is a pretty emotional placement, and so moon in Scorpio does allow you to link up with your own feelings, to get in touch with your feelings, and at the same time, you're perhaps going to be a little less intense. Now that might sound strange, because moon in Scorpio is supposedly as intense as it gets. But from a Pisces perspective, recently, there may have been a lot of thinking, but sort of deep thoughts, and it wasn't entirely comfortable, and you were perhaps having to deal with facts that you didn't really want to have to deal with, and facts which perhaps had a social nature, having to deal with other people's preferences and priorities, and it was difficult to make sense of it all. But now with a moon in Scorpio, you just get it. You don't have to think so much. And because you're able to feel rather than think, it just makes things easier, because you're just so much more in your element. And I suppose there may be moments of anxiety, because the moon is making a square to Mars, makes a square to Pluto, and you may not feel entirely comfortable with the way things are going, especially on a social level. I think socially it may actually take you a little bit of time to warm up, especially with people you haven't seen for some time. If you're dealing with people who are new, or you haven't seen them for years, then it does take you a bit of time to warm up. And that may be the moon square Pluto, moon square Mars, where your first inclination might be to be quite defensive, but then the moon makes a sextile to the sun, and I think that sextile between the moon and the sun, I think, is pretty fortunate, and it allows you to relax, and perhaps to spread your wings, and to see things from a broader perspective. And so I think socially, at the end of the day, I think that you are able to fit in quite well, and I think that you're going to feel that it's a reasonably pleasant Christmas. And that's it. Those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. I think I've succeeded in making them a little bit briefer than usual. And now I want to look at today from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like? For those watching the I Ching section of this video, and of course Wednesday, I didn't ask Christmas Day, but Wednesday is Christmas Day, so what's it going to be like? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 57, which is the gentle. Now, the gentle doesn't move. There were no moving lines. And so that may say something about today, when you got no moving lines. When you got no moving lines, there just may be a lack of process. It's about having a state, and one state not moving into another state. There may be a certain sense of stasis here. So perhaps we shouldn't expect too much action. And the advice with the gentle is not to be too assertive. It's quite a passive hexagram, but it's also about understanding, because the symbol for the gentle is the wind over the wind. So you see these two trigrams, they repeat each other. So each of those trigrams represents wind. So that's what it's about. And I suppose wind is about understanding something. You can perhaps imagine a house, and it's a house that you don't really understand. Maybe it's a big house. I sort of imagine a sort of rather square, haunted house-like thing, and you're like the wind rushing through the doors and the windows and just rushing through this house and just understanding everything and understanding the problems and understanding the opportunities as well. But that's perhaps how we should be like the wind. We don't have to actually do anything. It's all about understanding and trying our hardest to understand what's going on. And at the same time, there is a sense of influence. And the question is, how do we have an influence? The suggestion is we can influence other people, but we don't influence them by being super assertive. We influence them by, first of all, just understanding what's going on. Like the wind, we understand what's happening in front of us. We understand what's going on. Then we're perhaps able to assert ourselves, but very slowly. And indeed, there is a sense of crouching here. I think it's the Legge translation of the I Ching talks about crouching, and so it's almost saying that you have to make yourself small and insignificant in order to have an influence. So if you want to be powerful, you need to avoid being powerful. You just have to allow your influence to slowly spread. And it's useful when you're dealing with a locked hexagram, a hexagram with no moving lines, to consider the nuclear hexagram, the hexagram behind the hexagram. And you get the nuclear hexagram by knocking off the top and bottom lines, and then what you've got 4 lines left. You take the top 3 lines of the 4, you make that the top trigram, and then you take the bottom 3 lines of the 4, and that gives you the bottom trigram. And so the nuclear hexagram here is hexagram 38. Now, I must make it clear, this is not the hexagram. I know it says opposition. Actually, it should not be the opposition. That sounds very much like British politics. That's not what I meant to say at all. It's just opposition in general. We're not talking about the opposition to the government. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about straight opposition. So let me just remove the definite article. There we go. Okay, that's what I meant to say. 38, opposition. And when you're dealing with opposition, it's talking about how we relate to other people and just a feeling that we're not connected. And another concept is being separated, being estranged from other people. I mean, in fact, Greg Winkup, in his translation of I Ching, actually calls this 38, he doesn't call it opposition, I think he calls it estrangement, that we are disconnected. And maybe this is telling us about the background, perhaps before Christmas, and how we felt about other people. We just felt we were not properly linked up with them. And so this perhaps gives us more information about the gentle, what this really means. It's perhaps we know that there is a problem, or at least there has been a problem socially, and like the wind, we try to understand what it actually is, what it's all about. And we go through it, we understand why we're estranged from other people, and we come up with some answers, and we realize that the solution is not to be loud, to make a big effort to impose ourselves. We just have to just take things in and gently try to influence the situation. And if we do this, then we eventually start to make progress. And maybe this is also in terms of the astrology. We had the moon goes into Scorpio, the moon squares Pluto, moon squares Mars, then the moon makes a sextile to the sun. And the moon sextile sun is perhaps what we should be aiming for. So Moon square Mars, moon square Pluto could be about trying to resolve a problem. And perhaps it's very short term. It's perhaps a situation where if we're having a Christmas day with other people, at first things aren't moving, things are not happening. It doesn't seem that people are happy. But if we persevere and if we try to get to the roots of the matter, then we can understand what needs to be done, and then we can start to influence proceedings. And so perhaps through our active steps, we can turn a difficult Christmas perhaps into a genuinely happy or merry Christmas. And now I want to look at the moon in Scorpio. And I mean, the moon is in Scorpio, so I thought it'd be a good idea to consider, what this means. I mean, I think that in terms of the moon in Scorpio, you could say in terms of people with the moon in Scorpio, you could say it is very much the good, the bad and the ugly. And the moon doesn't work well, all things being equal, in Scorpio. And I know that sort of 1 in 12 people listening to this, assuming at least 12 people are listening to me, 1 in 12 of you will have your moon in Scorpio, and so I certainly don't want to offend anyone. And if you've got the moon in Scorpio in your chart, you have ways of dealing with it. I mean, just because in theory it's not great having moon in Scorpio, because it's in its detriment. Because it's fallen, because the moon is exalted in Taurus. Therefore, in Scorpio, all things being equal, doesn't work very well. We all have ways of dealing with these things in our chart. I've got Mars in Taurus. I mean, do I deal with it properly? Maybe not, but Mars in Taurus in its detriment. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Mars in Taurus. We're here to talk about moon in Scorpio. So the moon is about sort of how we respond. I think that in a female chart, you could argue the moon is more important than the sun, particularly from adulthood onwards. I mean, I take the view that the moon in a female chart is more about adulthood. But as a child, I think the sun perhaps is more important in a female chart, and it's the opposite in a male chart. So moon in Scorpio, the moon in Scorpio the moon sign can be important. Certainly in Vedic astrology, the moon, I would have said, is more important than the sun. But moon in Scorpio, it's an emotional sign. It's in a water sign, and it's a fixed sign. And so I suppose with moon in Scorpio, you get the idea of holding on to things very tightly, and you think about being quite broody and perhaps being unforgiving. I mean, that's stereotypical, isn't it? Remembering the past. The past, things may have happened 50 years ago, but they're still very real. And so we are in touch with the past, and the past is in the present all the time, and that may be how moon in Scorpio works. And when moon in Scorpio gets annoyed, it's kind of difficult for moon in Scorpio to release that annoyance. Things can be held on to very tightly. But on the plus side, moon in Scorpio is very sensitive. Moon in Scorpio picks things up. Sometimes you just have to pick things up. You have to know what's going on around you. And if you know what's going on around you, that means that you're in a position to act in such a way that can work in your favour. I mean, you've got to be, if you can understand popular moods, well, surely that does put you in a very good position. So let me now just go through a few people who have their moon in Scorpio. So I want to sort of start with the sort of vengeance feeling of that moon in Scorpio. And as you know, I'm sort of quite interested in sort of Second World War stuff. And there are 2 Second World War Air Force generals who had their moon in Scorpio. And one of those generals was Bomber Harris. So Bomber Harris was a British, I think it was Air Chief Marshal, And he was famous for saying, he made this speech talking about the Germans, and he said, that he talked about all the places the Germans had bombed, and he said, well, he's talked about sow the wind and reap the whirlwind, and he was a massive advocate of aerial bombing, and he saw it in terms of vengeance, and he believed that you could win a war by bombing people into submission. And he said, some people think it can't be done, but he said, well, it's never been tried. And you can see that I don't have a time of birth for Bomber Harris, but he's got his moon in Scorpio conjunct the South Node conjunct Uranus. I don't know precisely where his moon is, but it will be somewhere between, 1 degree Scorpio and 14 degrees Scorpio. So his moon is conjunct the South Node conjunct Uranus. And so what better description of moon conjunct Uranus, someone in Scorpio, wanting to retaliate on someone by bombing them into submission. And of course, moon conjunct South Node, was that really the right thing to do? So that's a way in which moon and Scorpio can work, and you do get a strong feeling of vengeance. And on the American side, Curtis LeMay had the moon in Scorpio. So he was born just before a new moon in Scorpio. Again, he was an Air Force general, and he was famous for instigating or being part of the planning of the Tokyo fire bombings. So the end of the Second World War, the sort of Japanese cities, including Tokyo, were just bombed into, a totally bombed to nothing. And of course, Tokyo, I think there were a lot of wooden buildings. And if you look at pictures of Tokyo after the bombings, it looks as if an atomic bomb had fallen. And of course, more people, I think, were killed in the Tokyo fire bombings than in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so he kind of similarly argued, let's be extreme about it. This is very much moon in Scorpio. Let's win the war by bombing them into submission. And after the war, he was a strong advocate of launching a preemptive nuclear attack on Russia. While Russia doesn't have, the Soviet Union didn't have a bomb, Curtis LeMay thought that he should, that America should get them while they're still weak, as a way of resolving problems over Berlin and so forth. And if you use the atomic bombs early, you can get the Soviet Union to submit. I think Curtis LeMay eventually became a vice presidential candidate. I get mixed up. I think he was he Wallace's vice presidential candidate in the 1968 election? That's when you had the Southern Democrats had their own party, and I think Wallace was it. And I think Wallace was the presidential candidate for I don't forget what they were called. I know they were the Southern Democrats. They did get some electoral vote college seats, but he was a vice presidential candidate in 1968. And also, I think Curtis LeMay, there is a theory, one of the characters in Dr. Strangelove, there is a view that may have been based on Curtis LeMay. So that's one way in which you can see moon in Scorpio. Moon in Scorpio can also be a great sense of justice, a feeling that something is wrong and something needs to be done about it, even if that means great personal sacrifice. And if you think about all the sort of WikiLeaks thing, and remember how Julian Assange has spent sort of so long on remand in the UK before finally being released, what he went through because of WikiLeaks. And then you think of Edward Snowden, who got concerned, I think, about the sort of the surveillance state, and he leaked information because he felt he had to. And likewise, Chelsea Manning, who was sent to prison for she released information. So those three, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Chelsea Manning, they all had moon in Scorpio. There's Julian Assange's chart, and he had his moon at 7 Scorpio. We do have a time birth for Julian Assange, so moon in Scorpio, trine sun in Cancer. and I suppose his moon in Scorpio and his Jupiter, moon in the same sign as Jupiter, acting in a fairly secretive way. And you look at his Mars on the IC, and so acting in a secretive way and just doing what he felt he had to do. And also moon in Scorpio, spending a lot of time in prison. I mean, it looked for a moment as if for quite a long time as if he'd be extradited to the US and they would just kind of throw the key away. That was the fear. And so I think his moon in Scorpio is working quite well. And then Edward Snowden, who fled to Russia in the end, and so he has the moon in Scorpio. And he I think, like Julian Assange, felt an obligation to release information. He didn't like what he saw, and as a result, he had to leave his country and go to Russia. Yeah, and that's how moon in Scorpio works. A moon in Scorpio, if you look at both Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, can be about someone who is acting behind the scenes, who does something quite secretive. And the same can be said for Chelsea Manning. So I don't have a time of birth for Chelsea Manning, but Chelsea Manning has Moon-Mars conjunction at around 15 Scorpio. Again, so her moon would be between, 7 Scorpio and 7 Scorpio and say 22 Scorpio, somewhere around there. But again, doing something in secret, taking information that I think she was a private in the military in the US. I don't know I can't offhand what branch of the military, and taking information out, and I think making it available to WikiLeaks, and of course that got her sent to prison. So there's moon in Scorpio. Now, moon in Scorpio can be very subjective. I mean, it has a belief about things, and that subjectivity can be a bit of a problem. And I suppose that does depend on your political perspective. If you think about the Supreme Court Judge Antonin Scalia, so Antonin Scalia was an originalist, don't they say? I mean, he was, I suppose, a right-wing judge. Who I suppose they're supposed to be neutral, but I think that I get the impression had a certain sympathy with the Republican Party. You could say that Antonin Scalia was a member of the Supreme Court that you could argue through the election in George Bush's direction in 2000. Remember with the hanging chads, when the Democrats got more votes than the Republicans, and all depended on Florida, and it went to the Supreme Court. I mean, I can't remember all the details, but the Supreme Court went on the gave it to the Republicans, and you could say that represents his bias, and perhaps his political bias. I mean, I know he's supposed to be neutral, but I think if you're a judge of Moon and Scorpio, it's really hard to be completely unbiased, and that might be a problem with having Moon and Scorpio. I mean, and of course, Moon and Scorpio is opposition Uranus. There's sort of something quite sort of surprising about that. And I know people on the right sort of lionize Antonin Scalia as being the perfect judge, but I do think there is a certain element of subjectivity there. And Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci, it was his birthday yesterday. Anthony Fauci was born on December the 24th, 1940. So yesterday would have been Anthony Fauci's 80th birthday. 84th birthday. 84 years, Uranus return. And so he's got his Uranus at 2242. So yeah, when you hit 84, that's your final return. So you get your Jupiter return when you're about 12. You get your Saturn return when you're about 29. And then you get your Uranus return when you're around 84. Of course, at the moment, people aren't going to live to their Neptune return. So Anthony Fauci, don't have a time of birth for Anthony Fauci. at noon in, where is it, Brooklyn, New York City. His moon was at 7 degrees 28 Scorpio, so I think pretty certain he has his moon in Scorpio. I don't really have enough knowledge about Anthony Fauci to make any real comment about the fact that he's got moon in Scorpio, but clearly with Anthony Fauci, there were certain things he passionately believed in. And I suppose he passionately believed in vaccinations, and I suppose you could say moon in Scorpio. It was Scorpio. There's a sense of being aware of one's power and one's influence, but I think he believed he was doing the right thing. I'm not going to comment on that. I was on vaccinations. I never personally had much of a problem with vaccinations. I got as many vaccinations as I could. I'd actually quite like another COVID vaccination, but they're difficult to get hold of now. But anyway, I'm not really a fanatical anti-vaxxer, although I understand the problems, and I understand certainly there seem to be issues with younger people, younger males and so forth, from what I gather. But I'm not an expert in terms of heart inflammation, and so that's perhaps a bit of a concern. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on with vaccinations, but I haven't really kept in touch with it. And as far as politics is concerned, Boris Johnson has moon in Scorpio, former British Prime Minister. And that moon in Scorpio with Boris Johnson, I think, is somewhat hidden because, he gives the impression of just being a Gemini. He was mayor of London, left-wing city, but he got elected because London is a Gemini city, and his predecessor, Ken Livingstone, had his son in Gemini. Boris had his son in Gemini, so he was able to get elected to be mayor of London. I think he had 2 terms, didn't he? But he has this sort of chaos to him, and sort of easygoing chaos. This is his image, the Gemini chaos that he has. And we don't see the moon in Scorpio. But I think that moon in Scorpio suggests another side to him, which is perhaps not quite so pleasant. And, you're thinking, Boris, for example, going to Kiev in April 2022. Was it April 2022? Around the time that Russia and Ukraine were trying to do a deal in Istanbul. And they were getting quite close to it. I think they'd initialed it. And then there is a view that Boris went to Kiev and sort of just told them to stop, that the West would give them everything they needed. And that was the end of it. I don't know whether it was Boris, but he was certainly part of the NATO alliance that scuppered the Istanbul talks. And I think that was a big disaster for Ukraine. I think actually those talks in Istanbul were, in many respects, they went in Ukraine's favor, particularly now. If you look at the situation now, I think Ukraine would have been in a much better position if they had agreed to those talks. And arguably there is a view Russia was actually quite naive in terms of what they were prepared to give away in 2022 at Istanbul. But anyway, Boris may have had some role in disrupting that and ensuring that Ukraine continued with its fight, and he had moon in Scorpio. And there just may be something sort of nasty and vindictive about Boris that we may not see on the surface. So that's Boris. Another politician with moon in Scorpio is the former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. She had moon in Scorpio. Moon in Scorpio, there are things she's very passionate about, perhaps motivated by the past. And we think about her ancestry in Ukraine. And so she is a fanatical supporter of Ukraine. And so, and of course, as a former member of the Canadian government, she was able to advocate for the Ukrainian cause. And there's, you ask why. And I think that the moon in Scorpio may be conjunct Neptune. We don't know exactly where her moon is. May have motivated her, the past, wanting to protect the past, and that can and perhaps recreate the past, and so that might be how her moon in Scorpio is working. And I think we're sort of running out of things to say, or rather running out of people. But with Scorpio, when we think about Scorpio, Aleister Crowley wrote about Scorpio he wrote his tarot book on a tarot. I think it's a Book of Thoth. He wrote that Moon in Scorpio did have three aspects. The highest aspect was the eagle, soaring above everything. The intermediate aspect was a snake hiding under a rock, and at its lowest level it was a scorpion. And I suppose with the scorpion you kind of had this myth that if you surround a scorpion with a ring of fire, it sort of stings itself to death. I mean, for example, a ring of petrol, a ring of gasoline. I don't know whether or not that's true. I think it's a myth. But in terms of self-immolation and burning yourself, then you have Jan Palach. Jan Palach was a Czech student. I've looked at his chart a couple of times before. He set himself on fire after the beginning of 1969, after the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and he felt incredibly frustrated. I assume he felt there was nothing more he could do, so his protest was to set himself on fire. And he did, I suppose he was perhaps influenced by the Vietnamese monk in 1963 who set himself on fire in Vietnam. That was a very highly publicized self-immolation. And yes, so you can see Jan Palach has South Node conjunct the Moon, widely conjunct Chiron, and of course, the Moon in Scorpio. So yes, there can be something rather self-destructive about the Moon in Scorpio. And another person who was very self-destructive, not just of herself and her family, was Magda Goebbels, wife of Joseph Goebbels, who had the Moon in Scorpio, new Moon in Scorpio. It was Magda Goebbels who refused to leave Berlin at the end, I think, as the Russians were closing in, and she had all her children killed, and then she and her husband Joseph Goebbels, then they committed suicide. So that, you could say, is Moon in Scorpio at its absolute worst. And I suppose the desire for vengeance and vindictiveness, as perhaps a person who was recently in the news, was Yahya Sinwar. So Yahya Sinwar was one of the leaders of Hamas, who was one of the masterminds of the Hamas's invasion of Israel, and the sort of the massacres and the atrocities that Hamas committed. And he definitely had Moon in Scorpio. We don't have a time of birth for him, but there is his Moon, 15 Scorpio, and apparently, obviously he hated the enemy. He hated the Israelis. When he was in prison, he was, I think, in Israel, when he was completely intolerant of people who had anything to do with the Israelis, no contact with the enemy, and in the end he was hunted down and was I don't know, there was that picture of him sort of throwing things at this Israeli helicopter or some drone that found him before he was blown up. So there is Yahya Sinwar, who has Moon in Scorpio. Anyway, those are a few examples of people with the Moon in Scorpio. I should point out that this is a biased sample. These are perhaps people I find interesting. I don't think they represent normal people with Moon in Scorpio, and they are somewhat extreme. But I suppose that's what happens when you when you use famous people to try to illustrate a point. I mean, I suppose you start to see Moon in Scorpio in perhaps quite a hyperbolic way when you look at famous people with dramatic life stories, but maybe there's an element of truth somewhere there if we can sort of unpick it. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Again, happy Christmas, and if you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. Anyway, I will talk to you again tomorrow.